In the spring of 1887, in the high silver country of the Coeur d'Alene district of Idaho Territory, a town called Bell Hollow had a building nobody wanted. It stood on the corner of the only proper street, 2 stories of board and shingle gone gray as ash, its windows blinded with dust, its door chained and the chain itself rusted into one solid orange shape. It had been an apothecary once. The man who ran it had died 11 years before, and in all that time no soul had so much as turned the lock. When the county finally put it up at auction to clear the back taxes, the bidding opened and closed in the time it takes to draw a breath, because only one person raised a hand, and what she raised was $2, and the men gathered on the courthouse steps laughed the way men laugh at a thing they have already decided is a joke. Her name was Naomi Hale, and she was 20 years old, and 3 weeks earlier she had been put out of her own home with a carpet bag and the clothes on her back. You will want to know how a girl that age comes to be standing alone at a tax sale buying a ruin. Stay with this one. What was sealed inside that building had been waiting 11 years for the right pair of hands, and the hands that finally came were the only ones in the territory that could have opened it. Naomi had not always been alone. She had been raised in Bell Hollow by her grandfather, a quiet man named Eli Hale, who had kept the very apothecary that now stood chained until the winter his heart gave out and the shop passed into the hands of the bank that held his note. After that, she had lived with her father's people, an uncle named Royce who ran a freight concern, and a stepmother who counted every biscuit. They had tolerated her so long as she worked, and she had worked hauling water before light, and scrubbing the long plank floors of the freight office and mending harness by lamp until her fingers cracked. But the week she turned 20, her uncle informed her that a grown woman was a grown woman's own burden, and that there was a man 2 valleys over, a widower with a temper and a half-grown brood of his own, who would have her and ask no dowry. Naomi had said no. She had said it once, plainly, standing in the kitchen with a dish towel still in her hands, and her uncle had not argued, which was worse than arguing. He had simply gone out to the porch and set her carpet bag on the boards beside the door, and come back in and told her the door behind her was no longer hers. To open, her stepmother had watched from the stove and said nothing at all. There had been no shouting. There is a kind of cruelty that wears the face of arithmetic, that adds a person up and finds the sum not worth keeping, and it does its work without ever raising its voice. So she had walked the 9 miles back into Bell Hollow, where she had been a child, the carpet bag banging her knee and the spring mud sucking at her boots, and she had taken a room above the laundry for 50 cents a week, a room so small the slope of the roof would not let her stand upright at the window. And she had sat on the narrow cot in the dark and begun to think about what a person with nothing actually owns. What she owned was a skill and a memory, and the both of them came from the same man. Eli Hale had not been only a shopkeeper. He had been a compounder, an old word for a man who knew how the parts of the natural world fit and fought and balanced one another, who could take bark and root and mineral salt and render them into something that eased a fever or closed a wound. He had learned it back east before the war and carried it across the plains in a wooden chest, and from the time Naomi was 6 years old, he had taught her the way a man teaches the only child who will listen. He taught her the smell of things. He taught her that a bottle wrongly stoppered will tell you so with its color. He taught her to read a label that had faded past reading by the weight and the settle of what was inside. Most of all, he had taught her one sentence, and he had said it so often it had worn a groove in her. A thing is only worthless to the man who does not know what it is. She had buried him at 14. She had not been allowed to keep his chest, nor his books, nor anything of his at all, because the bank had taken the shop and everything the shop contained, and the shop had been locked, and that was the end of it, or so the town believed. What the town did not know, what Naomi herself had only half remembered until she stood at that auction with her $2 warm in her fist, was that her grandfather had built that building with his own hands, and a man who builds with his own hands builds for himself. The day the sale was settled, she walked to the corner with the deed folded in her satchel and stood in front of the place a long while. A man named Tate, who ran the dry goods across the way and had bid on nothing, came out to lean in his doorway and watch her. He was 60, if he was a day, white-whiskered with a bad hip that made him stand crooked, and he had known Eli Hale. "You bought the Hale place," he said. "It was not a question I did," Naomi answered, "for $2. He said it the way a man says the price of a thing he believes you have been cheated on. "Worrell, there's nothing in there but 11 years of mouse dirt and a stink. The bank cleared it out before they ever locked it. Sold the stock, sold the fixtures, sold the chest of books your granddad set such store by. I watched the wagon haul it off myself." "I remember the wagon," she said. "Then you know there is nothing left." "I know what they could see," she said, and she turned the key the county had given her in the rusted lock, and when it would not move, she took from her satchel a small steel pick and a flat of oil, and she worked the wards the way her grandfather had once shown her a lock will yield to patience long after it has stopped yielding to force, and after the better part of an hour, the bolt slid back with a sound like a held breath. Let go, the smell that came out was old air, dust and dry rot, and the ghost of camphor. 11 years of stillness pressing out past her into the street. Tate behind her made a sound in his throat. Naomi stepped inside. The front room was exactly the ruin he had promised. Empty shelves climbed both walls, their varnish crazed and peeling. The long counter where her grandfather had stood was furred gray with dust. A cracked mortar lay on its side in a corner where the bank's men had not thought it worth carrying. Sunlight came through the dirty glass in 2 solid bars and lit the floating dust like something underwater. It was a dead place, and it had been picked clean, and any reasonable person would have stood in it and understood at last that $2 had bought $2 of nothing. Naomi did not stand still. She walked the room slow, with one hand trailing the wall, and she counted her steps, and at the back wall she stopped and counted again. Then she went out the chained door, around the side, paced off the length of the outside of the building, came back in and paced off the inside, and stood very quiet with a figure sitting in her head. The building was 4 feet longer on the outside than it was on the inside. She had not imagined it. As a small girl, she had asked her grandfather once why the back wall of the shop was so close behind the counter, when the building looked so deep from the alley, and he had smiled and tapped the side of his nose and told her that some things a man keeps for the people who come after, and that she would understand it when she needed to and not before. She had been 7. She had forgotten it for 13 years. She remembered it now, standing in the dust with the measurements not matching, and her heart began to go hard and slow in her chest. There was a room back there. There had always been a room back there. And the bank, in all its clearing and selling and locking, had never known it existed. She told no one. She thanked Tate for his trouble, and she let him believe she was a foolish girl who had bought a ruin out of sentiment, and she went back to her room above the laundry and lay awake the whole night with her grandfather's sentence turning over and over. A thing is only worthless to the man who does not know what it is. In the morning she bought a candle, a crowbar, a hand lamp, and a paper of nails on credit she could barely promise to honor. And she went back to the dead shop and shut the door behind her and began to look for the way in. It was not in the back wall she had been sure it would be, and it was not. She spent the whole of the first day running her fingers along every board, tapping with the knuckle of one finger for the hollow note that would tell her where the solid wood gave way to empty air, and the back wall answered solid all the way across, a dull, true thud, board after board. She tried the floor next on her knees in the dust, prying at planks with the crowbar, until 2 came up and showed her nothing but packed earth and the smell of it. She tried the ceiling, standing on the dusty counter with the lamp held high, until her arm ached. By dusk her hands were gray to the wrist and full of splinters, and her back was a single ache, and she had found nothing, and the doubt came in the way. Doubt comes quiet and reasonable, telling her she had misremembered, that the 4 feet were a trick of pacing, that a girl who wanted a thing badly enough would measure it into being. She sat down on the dusty floor in the last of the light with the crowbar across her knees, and she did not cry because she had learned a long while ago that crying spent strength she could not spare, but she came near it. She thought of her uncle's porch and the carpet bag on the boards. She thought that perhaps a person was only ever worth what other people decided, and that she had decided otherwise out of pride and nothing more. Then she looked at the shelves. The shelving on the back wall ran floor to ceiling, the same as the side walls, fixed and immovable, or so it appeared. Her grandfather had built these shelves, though, and her grandfather had built nothing without a reason. She got up. She held the lamp close and went over the back shelving inch by inch, and at the 3rd tier from the bottom, behind where a row of bottles would once have stood, she found that the wood was worn. Not weathered. Worn in 2 small places, the way a thing is worn by a hand that has touched it 10,000 times in the same 2 spots. She set her own fingers where the wear was. She pressed, nothing. She pulled, nothing. Then she did, both at once, pressed in, and lifted up the way you might work a stiff latch you already know the shape of, and somewhere inside the wall a wooden catch, let go with a dry knock, and the entire back section of shelving swung in on a hinge so cunningly hidden that she had run her fingers across the gap a dozen times and felt only a seam. Cold air came out, cold and dry, and absolutely still, the air of a space that had been sealed when she was a child of 9 and had not been breathed since. She stood at the black opening with the lamp shaking a little in her hand, and she did not go in for a moment because she understood all at once that whatever was on the other side, her grandfather had meant it for her, had built the catch to fit a hand, and worn the wood himself, teaching that hand where to press, and that she was about to open the one piece of him the world had not been allowed to take. Then she lifted the lamp and stepped through. What she did not yet know was that the room held more than her grandfather's memory. It held the proof of a theft that had ruined 3 families in Bell Hollow, and the name of the man who had done it, and that man was still alive, and still respected, and still living 4 doors down the same street. The hidden room was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10, and the lamp filled it with moving gold. Along one wall stood the chest. Her grandfather's compounding chest. The one Tate had watched the bank haul away on a wagon, except it had not been that chest at all. She understood now. It had been a decoy stuffed with common bottles, while the true chest had sat here in the dark the whole time. Its wood was oiled and sound, the grain dark and close, the corners bound in brass that the dry sealed air had kept from tarnishing so that it caught the lamplight like something only that morning polished. When she lifted the lid, the smell that rose was her childhood entire, the dense green and mineral smell of the trade he had taught her, camphor and clove and the sharp clean bite of the spirits he kept his tinctures in, and the rows of stoppered bottles were intact, labeled in his small upright hand, each one a thing she could name on sight. She touched them in their slots the way you touch the hand of someone you had given up for lost. Belladonna, drawn careful and dark willow, bark for fever. The blue glass he always used for the things that would not bear the light. 11 years had not moved, one of them a hair's breadth from where he had set it. It was not the chest that stopped her breath, though it was the ledger. On a narrow table beneath the room's single boarded window sat a leather book the size of a family Bible, and beside it a tin box, and on top of the tin box, weighted by a smooth river stone, a letter folded and sealed with wax, and addressed in that same upright hand to a name she had not expected. It was addressed to her. She did not open the letter first. She has said since, in the years after, that she could not, that her hands would not do it, and so instead she opened the ledger, because a ledger was a thing she could bear to read, and what she read there took the rest of that day and most of the night. Her grandfather had not only compounded medicine in a town with no bank of its own until the last years of his life. Eli Hale had been the man people trusted with what little they could lay by. A miner, with a season's wages and no safe place for them, would leave a poke of dust with Eli, and Eli would write it in the ledger, the weight and the date and the man's mark, and keep it locked, and the man could draw on it when he needed it. It was an old arrangement, the kind of quiet, honest machinery that held small places together before the institutions came. The ledger recorded years of it, page after page of names she half knew, sums entered and sums drawn, all of it balanced and true. And then, in the last 2 years of the book, the balance stopped being true. The man who had come to Bell Hollow and built the first real bank was named Garrett Voss. He was still there. Naomi had seen him only that week, a heavy, prosperous man in a good coat who tipped his hat to ladies and was spoken of as the making of the town. The ledger told a different story. When Voss's bank opened, he had gone to the miners and the widows who kept their savings with old Eli Hale, and told them, with papers and a smile and the weight of a chartered institution behind him, that the old man's arrangement was no longer lawful, that their deposits must be transferred to the bank for their own protection, and that Eli would render the accounts to him directly. Eli, sick by then and slow, had begun the transfer, and Voss had recorded receiving a great deal less than Eli's ledger showed him sending. The difference, totaled in her grandfather's failing hand across the final pages, came to a little over $9,000. $9,000 in the savings of perhaps a dozen families gone into the foundations of a respectable bank, and the only record that it had ever existed was the book in front of her, because Voss had been so certain the old man's papers had died with him in a locked and emptied shop. At the bottom of the last page her grandfather had written a single line, not in the language of accounts, but in his own. "I could not prove it before I died. Perhaps you can. The work is patient, so must you be." Then she opened the letter, and she read it, and what was in it was not money and not instruction, but the plain love of a man who had known he was dying and had built a room to hold the truth until the one person he trusted with it was ready to find it. He had not known when she would come. He had only built the catch to fit her hand and trusted that a hand he had taught would remember the way. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it inside her dress against her heart where it stayed, and she sat in the cold room until the candle guttered, and somewhere in those hours the grief and the fury settled in her into the one thing her grandfather had named. Patience. The work is patient, so must you be. A lesser story would have her run into the street with the ledger held high. Naomi did no such thing. She understood, sitting there, exactly what she held, and exactly what it was worth, and exactly how easily a girl of 20 with no standing could have it taken from her or burned or sworn away. Voss was the bank. Voss was respected. A ledger in the hands of a cast-out girl was an accusation. And an accusation against a powerful man is a thing that gets a powerless person hurt. She needed the truth to be undeniable before she let a single soul know it had survived. She needed it to walk on its own legs. So she went to work, and the work took her the better part of a year, and it began with the one ally she chose to trust. She chose Tate. She chose him because he had known her grandfather and had watched the wagon, and had told her plainly there was nothing left, which meant he was honest enough to be wrong out loud. She did not show him the ledger. She came to him with a careful question instead, asking what he remembered of the year Voss's bank had opened, and the old man's face changed, and he told her that he had lost $200 of his own, in that transfer money he had left with Eli Hale and never seen again, and that he had always believed without a scrap of proof. That the old man had been robbed in his sickness, and the town robbed with him. He had said as much once in the early days, and Voss had threatened him with a suit for slander. And Tate had a wife then, and could not afford to be ruined, and so he had swallowed it. He had carried it 12 years. If a person had proof, Naomi said, real proof, what would a person do with it? Tate looked at her a long moment, and something in his crooked old frame straightened. Carefully, he said. A person would do it carefully. Voss owns the sheriff's good opinion and half the paper the town is printed on. You do not knock down a man like that with noise. You knock him down with a thing he cannot argue with, in front of people he cannot frighten. That became the work. First, she had to be certain the ledger was true, beyond any lawyer's power to muddy. So she took the names from the final pages, the dozen families, and over the slow months she went to each one she could find. And she did not tell them what she had. She only asked them quietly what they remembered. An old widow named Selby, who lived alone at the end of the lane with a goat and a stove that smoked, remembered leaving $400 with Eli Hale, the whole of what her husband had left her, and being told by the bank when she came to draw on it that she had left too. She had wept in the bank's front room, the widow said, and the clerk had been gentle and the figures had been firm, and a gentle clerk and a firm figure together will make an old woman believe she has misremembered her own life. A miner gone gray, a Cornishman named Pascoe with hands like roots, remembered the same kind of arithmetic worked on his season's wages, and remembered, too, that he had argued, and that arguing had got him nowhere but a warning. One by one, without ever seeing her grandfather's book, they told her numbers, and one by one those numbers matched the ledger's left-hand column, the honest column, exactly. 12 independent memories, each confirming a figure Voss had altered, none of them knowing the others had been asked. By the spring of 1888, Naomi had a dozen witnesses who did not know they were witnesses, and a book that agreed with every one of them. Second, she had to make the ledger speak in a way a court would hear. Here her grandfather's true craft, the compounder's craft, became the key to a thing it had never been meant to open. Voss's defense, when it came, would be simple, that the book was a forgery written up by a vengeful girl. Naomi knew inks, though. Her grandfather had taught her to make them, iron filings and the galls that grow on oak, and a little gum to bind them, and to know them, the way the iron darkens slowly in the fiber of the paper over years until an entry written in one season cannot be made to match an entry written in another. She knew that the entries spanned years and that the inks had aged differently page to page, in a way no forger working in a single winter could fake. The early pages gone the warm brown of old harness, the late pages still nearer black. She knew that the dust in the sealed room had settled on the closed book in a fine, even pattern down the gutter of the binding that proved how long it had lain undisturbed. For dust does not settle so on a book a person has been writing in. She knew that her grandfather's hand had degraded across the final pages in the exact way a dying man's hand degrades the letters, growing larger and looser and the lines drifting from the level, and that this too could be shown to anyone with eyes. She gathered all of it, the way he had taught her to gather the parts of a remedy, each one chosen because it answered a particular need, no part of it for show. And she assembled them into something whole, a case that did not depend on her word at all, because her word was the one thing a powerful man could call worthless. Through that long year, she lived on almost nothing. She reopened the front of the apothecary not to sell the old stock, which was hers and which she guarded, but to compound simple remedies from what she could buy and gather, salves and fever powders and the cough syrup her grandfather had been known for. She scrubbed the gray furring of dust from the long counter on her hands and knees, washed 11 years from the 2 windows until the bars of light came through clean, and set out on the cleaned shelves the few honest bottles she could afford to fill. She walked the hills above the town in the early mornings for the things that grew free, yarrow and wild cherry bark and the bitter root that broke a fever, and she ground them in the cracked old mortar she had righted from the corner, and the work settled her, the way it had settled her grandfather, the rhythm of the pestle, a kind of thinking. The town, which had laughed at her $2, came slowly to her door because her preparations worked and cost less than the doctor 2 valleys over. First the laundress, who had let her the room, then the laundress's neighbor, then the neighbor's husband with a cough that had hung on since Christmas. She earned her bread with the very skill that was about to undo the most powerful man in the county, and not one of the people who bought her salves had any idea that the gray-eyed, quiet girl behind the counter was holding the town's stolen savings in a locked room 4 feet deep behind her own back wall. There was a night the work nearly came apart. Voss, who Miss Little had noticed the Hale shop open again, had noticed the cast-out girl asking old people old questions, and one evening in the autumn of that year he came to the shop himself, filling the doorway in his good coat, the bell over the door going quiet behind him as though it too thought better of speaking. He looked the room over slowly, the clean shelves, the honest bottles, the cracked mortar, the way a man appraises a thing he is deciding the price of. He bought a packet of headache powder. He did not need laying the coin down with 2 soft fingers, and looked at her with eyes that were not unkind and were entirely cold. "You favor your grandfather," he said. He was a stubborn man, clever but stubborn. It did not serve him in the end. He turned the small packet over in his hand. A young woman alone wants to be careful what old business she stirs. The past is a settled thing in this town. Settled things are best left, so a great many people prefer them settled, and a great many people in this town owe me their good morning. "I only sell remedies," Naomi said, and she said it so flatly, with so little behind it, drying a bottle with a cloth as she spoke and not meeting his eye, that he studied her another moment, and then decided she was no one, and tipped his hat and left. The bell spoke once as the door closed. She stood behind the counter until his footsteps died away down the boardwalk. Then she went to the back and opened the catch and stood in the cold room with the ledger, and her hands were steady. He had come to frighten her, and he had told her something. Instead, he was afraid. A man who is certain does not warn. Voss was not certain the old man's papers were gone. He had never been certain, not in 12 years, not for a single night. And that uncertainty had sat in him like a stone the whole time he tipped his hat to ladies. His coming had told her the last thing she needed to know, which was that she was close. She finished her assembling that winter. And then, instead of going to the sheriff, Voss owned, instead of going to a court, Voss could reach, she did the patient thing, the thing her grandfather would have done. The territory sent a circuit judge through the district twice a year, a man from outside the county who held no debt to anyone in Bell Hollow, and she waited for him, and she did not wait idle. Through Tate she had quietly gathered the dozen families, told them at last, only days before, what she held, and asked them to be in the town hall on the day the judge sat. 12 families. Some of them had not spoken to each other in years. All of them came the day the truth walked on its own legs was a cold, bright morning in February of 1889. The judge sat to hear the small business of the district, deeds and disputes and a quarrel over a boundary fence, the wood stove at the back of the hall ticking and the windows white with frost. And when the ordinary matters were done, Naomi Hale rose from the back of the hall where she had been sitting unnoticed in her grandfather's old gray shawl. And she asked to be heard, and there was a ripple of the old laughter, the $2 laughter. A man near the front saying something behind his hand to the man beside him, until she walked the length of the room and laid the ledger on the table in front of the judge and began, in her level voice, to explain what it was. She did not accuse, she had learned that from Tate. She did not point at Voss, who sat in the second row, gone very still, his good coat suddenly too large for him. She simply showed the book, and then she showed why the book was true. She showed the aging of the inks she had made her grandfather's way, holding 2 pages to the window light so the judge could see the older entries gone browner than the new. She showed the settle of the dust along the gutter of the binding. She showed the failing hand across the final pages, the letters growing larger and looser as a dying man's grip loosens. And then, one after another, without dramatics, she called the names from the honest column, and one after another the people stood, the widow Selby and her good black, the Cornishman Pascoe turning his hat in his root-knuckled hands, 10 others, and each said the same plain thing, that this was the sum left with Eli Hale, and this the lesser sum the bank had claimed, 12 times, each figure matching the book that none of them had been allowed to see before that week. By the 7th name, the hall had gone silent in a different way. By the 12th, there was no laughter left anywhere in the territory of Bell Hollow. The judge examined the ledger for a long time. He was a dry, careful man, and he asked hard questions, and Naomi answered everyone with the steadiness of a person who has checked her work 100 times in the dark. He asked how the book had survived. She told him of the room. He sent 2 men to look, and they came back and described the hidden catch and the cold sealed air, and the judge wrote it down. When it was finished, he did not pound a gavel or make a speech. He simply ordered the bank's records produced and impounded against the ledger, and within the week the comparison was made, and Garrett Voss's careful figures, examined beside the truth at last, fell apart exactly the way her grandfather had promised patient work would make them fall. Voss was never met in any final scene. That is not how these things truly end. He did not rage or confess or flee in the night. The auditors came, the territory's men, outside men, and they sat with his books, and the respectable foundation he had stood on for 12 years was found to be partly built of other people's money, and the weight of it simply pressed him out of the place he had held. His charter was pulled. His good coat meant nothing to men from the capital. Within the year he had sold what was honestly his and gone east, a smaller man than he had been, undone, not by an accusation shouted in the street, but by a book a dying compounder had hidden behind a wall and trusted his granddaughter to find. The town spoke of him less and less, and then it did not speak of him at all. The money was the slow part, as restitution always is. There was not $9,000 to be simply handed back. The bank's seized assets were sorted by the territory, though, and over the next 2 years, the families on the honest pages of Eli Hale's ledger were repaid what could be repaid, a portion at first and then more. The widow Selby, her $400, Tate his $200, the gray miner, his season's wages 12 years late. Naomi oversaw none of it and claimed none of it. She had taken nothing for herself from the ledger, not a dollar, and when one of the repaid families pressed a sum on her in gratitude, she refused it, and when they pressed again she told them, in the plainest words she owned, that the debt had been her grandfather's to honor, and she had only finished his accounts. Restored, not enriched. That was the whole of what she wanted. What she kept was the shop, the dismissed building on the corner, bought for $2 and laughed at on the courthouse steps, became the thing the town could not do without. She compounded there for the rest of her working life. The hidden room she did not seal again, nor did she make a shrine of it. She moved her grandfather's true chest out into the light and used it. Every day the bottles and the brass warmed brighter by her hands, and the cold, dry space behind the wall she turned into what it had always been meant to be, a place to keep safe the things people trusted to her, for there was still no proper bank in Bell Hollow that anyone wished to use, and a great many people in that town had decided that the granddaughter of Eli Hale was the one human being in the district whose ledger would always tell the truth. Tate lived 8 more years and spent most evenings on a stool by her counter, his bad hip propped, telling her things about her grandfather she had been too young to know. The town that had laughed came around the way such towns do, not with apology, which is rare and costs too much, but with custom and with greeting, and with the small daily respect that is worth more than apology, because it is paid every day. No one ever again said the words $2 in Naomi Hale's hearing as anything but a kind of wonder. She married late or not at all, depending on which of the old people you asked years afterward. And it did not much matter to the story, because the story was never going to be about a husband. It was about a girl put out of a house with a carpetbag, who knew one thing the world had decided was worthless, and who used it to open a door that had been built and worn and sealed by the only person who had ever truly seen her, and to set right behind it a wrong that 12 families had carried in silence for more than a decade. There is a thing, her grandfather used to say, that she said herself in her turn to the children who came after, the ones who hung about the shop to watch her grind and measure. A thing is only worthless to the man who does not know what it is. She would say it, and then she would hand them the worn place on the back shelving and let them press it, press in and lift, and feel the catch let go, and watch their faces in the cold air coming out, and she never tired of their faces. In the last spring of her long life she sat in the front room of the shop, in the 2 bars of afternoon light that came through the glass she had long since cleaned, and the dust still floated in them, gold and slow the way it had the first day. On the counter beside her, oiled and sound and untarnished, the brass catching the light, sat the chest her grandfather had hidden, and she had found, its lid open, a remedy half measured in the cracked old mortar she had never thrown away. Her hand rested on the worn place of the wood. The catch was warm under her fingers where 10,000 pressings, his and hers and the children's, had worn it smooth as a river stone, and the back room stood open behind her, full of light now, holding nothing it needed to hide. What would you have done if a man who loved you left the truth, sealed in the dark, and trusted that your hands would remember the way to it? If a story like this one is the kind you keep with you, there are others, and they are waiting the way that room waited, for someone patient enough to open them.